On the 4th of March, the House of Keys will choose 4 people to become members of the Legislative Council. Prior to that vote, Agenda will be speaking with all the candidates so that you can find out more about the people that hope to become national politicians. We hear in the second part of tonight's LegCo Agenda special from businessman Mark Cleator, who is attempting to get elected to LegCo at his first attempt.
Well, a lot of people on the Isle of Man already know me. I'm quite deep into all of the small and medium businesses on the Isle of Man regarding accounting systems and IT and websites and VAT and lots of things like that. I've been involved for many years on the artistic side with the video making with Charles for the Heritage Foundation. I have a disabled daughter, so I'm obviously familiar with maybe some of the harder sides of social services. I play in bands, I do live sound. I'm pretty much all over the place.
So then the next obvious question is why? Why do you want to go to be a member of the Legislative Council?
It was certainly never part of my plan. Obviously, I've known you and many other MHKs and MLCs through the years, as you would expect on a small island. But 10 years ago, I found myself entrenched in a land dispute, which has been quite unpleasant. What that caused me to do, as somebody who usually manages to fix things properly, it caused me to dive into legislation and read the acts that were important to that. So probably 7 years of spending my time looking at act after act after act and seeing how things actually work. I've come out of it with an additional skill, which is being able to, without fear, launch into an act of Tynwald and glean from it whatever I might need, whether it's good or bad. And in my case, I identified situations where the act of Tynwald wasn't very well written, not complete in my opinion, and I showed that to the Commission, to the Constitutional Legal Affairs Committee. And so once these positions came up in LegCo, I've been pushed towards this by a few people saying, you really ought to apply for that. You do know your stuff. You need to have a very broad experience from what I can tell, because if you're going to be presented with legislation that you need to check the efficacy of, then you do need to be able to think out of the box, perhaps so that you can try to predict where that legislation may be abused. It's easily abused. Finally, it's tested in the courts, and that's where the twists and turns of the legislation can be will really be drawn out, and ultimately, then you can have results which were unintended by the originators, by the MHKs, who first came along and suggested we need to have this new law, this new act, etc. People say that there is a lack of knowledge of the law is no defence. Well, I think it probably is now with the amount of it that there is. It's extremely difficult to read. It's extremely difficult to find the time to do it. And you really do need to try to stay switched on to try to understand it. It's the world of the lawyers, of the advocates, which perhaps I might think are out of control, but that's not the only reason that I'm here. There's the social services side as well. I feel like I can advise because I have so much experience in so many areas: technical, building, computers, and obviously in the world of disability, education. I've had many meetings in the schools because of having to organise special needs arrangements. That sometimes doesn't quite go the way you might think it should. So many things have passed me. I'm 57 now. I'm still in business. My business is run generally without too much input from me, which is quite good. And I also advise other businesses, generally in the accounting area, in the VAT area, etc., like that. But sometimes with contracts, it's just who I am. I'm a fixer. I'm somebody who can be spoken to, and I'm likely to come up with an answer. And whether you like it or not, it's at least going to be something to consider.
And you mentioned there about reading bills, and yeah, I think it is. I don't think anyone can reasonably say that they enjoy reading bills, but I guess after several years of reading bills, you started. Well, I don't know. You tell me. How was that experience in terms of coming effectively from a position of perhaps very limited understanding to where you are now?
Well, I did work in the General Registry in the 80s for 3 years, and I was a Commissioner for Oaths. So I did spend time with legislation regarding company law. I did have the Company Acts back then, and I had to try to stick to those, try to understand those. And I was into deeds as well, so the Deeds Registry there was the grantors and the grantees indexes. So I was starting to understand, even at a young age, the way that government operations were. So a lot of my time has been spent perhaps being forensic with numbers. So if you can consider that I quite enjoy sitting there and actually making sure that numbers work out to the penny. I do remember when I used to be in the General Registry and sitting on the counter, I used to make the till balance every single day, which was considered to be impossible. And I proved it day after day after day until people had to learn that they needed to work a little bit harder and actually focus on what they were doing. So I already have that mental capacity to get deep into something with the numbers. And so I basically was doing the same thing when I was having my legal trouble with the Acts of Tynwald regarding land law in that situation. But it doesn't really make any difference which one you're reading. They're all fascinating, actually, once you start getting into it. You have the Bribery Act and the Fraud Act, and another interesting one is the Interpretation Act 2015, which tells you what all the words mean. So I obviously there's many more that it's going to be difficult to know about when I'm just effectively a layman. But also in this position, there's an element of training that they suggest, which I'm going to find very interesting if I can actually get over the line as such.
My favourite piece of legislation was I think it was the 1908 Agriculture Act, which basically empowered the minister to do whatever he wanted to support agriculture, which I thought was excellent. But sadly, maybe not sadly, I don't know. Lawyers will give good reason why, but legislation now is much more complex and tries to second guess circumstances that may or may not arise. How would you go about assessing a new bill that comes before you?
Well, you do have to read every single line, clause by clause, and try to work out what is meant. And if it's too hard to understand, you need to find out what it actually means and then rewrite it so that it can be understood. Part of my frustrations with the whole thing is everything seems to be written backwards. And if it's written backwards, I'd like to know why it has to be that way.
And what do you mean by that?
When you read acts, they sometimes initially imply a completely different meaning than they actually mean once you really get deep in, and one suspects that is written really to help the lawyers have a job, and I just don't know why it's like that yet. I don't think it's right. I think plain English hasn't been achieved yet. If the common man is supposed to understand the laws, then it needs to be written in a way that they can actually understand it. And I can use big words as much as the next man, but let's simplify if we possibly can. And in a lot of cases, the regulations trying to come up with every single situation is possibly one of the problems, where common sense is suddenly utterly eliminated. The outcome of some results are not right. because in trying to fix every single circumstance, you'll get one off to a side that didn't work, and the Doomsters are compelled to make what could be the wrong decision, but it's the right decision based on the interpretation of the Act as it was. That's why it's so important for the Legislative Council to actually get these things right, really, really work hard and focus on it. I did a tongue-in-cheek submission. I did a tongue-in-cheek petition in 2023 suggesting we needed about 1,300 extra laymen to have our legislation checked to the same level as the legislation is checked in England, because I'm not particularly interested in the fact that we only have 88,000 people here and we've got 63 million or however many it is in England. Our law carries a lot of weight. It carries just as much weight for the Manx citizens as the law in England carries for English citizens, yet we have 35 people checking that and they have 1,500. So I think it was reasonable to really highlight the fact we've got this problem, that there's not enough people actually out there, intelligent people actually checking the legislation properly. So I suggested we have maybe 1,300 unpaid or paid laymen who are experts in certain fields or whatever. I really didn't intend that to be true. It's obviously impossible. We are small, but what it's doing is highlighting exactly how important it is that this legislation is fully tested. One of the other things I thought about was that perhaps because we do have this problem of not enough people checking the legislation before it actually is promulgated, that maybe it should, before it's promulgated, perhaps go back out to the public to say, this is what we're planning on doing. Show anybody who wants to, just give us a final opinion on this, because that would probably do it. But if we've only really got 8 people plus the bishop and the speaker and the attorney general in there checking the work of the MHKs obviously come up with the ideas. They're the ones that are voted in, so they're the ones that have to do what the public are asking of them, and the MLCs then have to have a look at it.
Do you think, though, well, I don't know, what is your understanding of the role of an MLC? Because there does seem to be a little bit of, willful confusion as to what you are. On the one hand, you're supposed to be purely about legislative scrutiny, and yet on the other hand, you sit in Tynwald and have a vote on policy and finance. So where do you see your role? What are the key aspects of the role?
I think because it's not a voted-in position, it should only be a scrutiny position. If you were actually talking about fairness, and obviously the system is as the system is, and I'm not suggesting the system gets changed, but I'm certainly suggesting there seems to be a problem to me as somebody who looks at things, whether they're fair or not. Why would people who haven't been voted in by the public have a vote on something that affects the public? So, I would actually question whether that vote should be there, and that's why even this interview, as you know, I'm actually mildly reluctant that the public should even be interested in who I am or why I'm doing this, because actually I'm just checking what your MLCs are doing. What your MHKs are doing. The MHKs are doing something and the MLCs are just checking that it works. That seems to be how it should be. So,
but MLCs do have an ability, whether it's correct or not, they do have an ability to influence. And actually there are times, and I guess as an MLC, if you are successful, you may come across this where you think, actually, you know what, that House of Keys have collectively come up with something that's really daft here. How would you approach that?
Well, you'd obviously, as far as I can tell, the way that it works is that you would discuss that with your colleagues, and you then hand it back down to the lower house, and the lower house then considers your opinions. But if they don't agree with you, then they can have a vote and they can throw your opinions out anyway. So if they really, really want to push something through, they can. The MLCs are only there to to guide, but ultimately the MHKs are the ones who have the final say.
And one of the things that I would guess you would find if you were successful on Tuesday the 4th of March and you become an MLC is a number of phone calls from ministers trying to woo you into their departments. What would you say to a minister who was hoping you could join their department and help them out?
It would depend which department it was and how many problems they had, and I would openly discuss everything with everybody, but I would be very interested to see how any department that I was involved with was working. And obviously, like everybody else, I have an opinion, but until I know more, I can say nothing on those subjects.
But you would be willing to become a member of a department in the right circumstance?
I'd quite like to fix everything if I possibly could.
Well, there's a challenge with just 5 years. So what are the kind of the burning issues as you see them? I mean, obviously, you get around, you talk to people. What are the things that you think need fixing, and how would you go about trying to influence that as an MLC?
Well, if I had any influence, then excruciating overspend in many areas. Excruciating overspend. Quangos, don't like them. Overextension of what seems to be departmental control, civil servants taking things a lot further than I think they ought to. I would prefer small government. We're only a small island. How can we have such big government? But as I say, until I know why things are required, it's difficult to say why they've ended up as they are. You know, if you look at a particular department and you ask a question as to why is that being done and why is that being done and why is that being done, and you get a perfectly reasonable answer, then I suppose it needs to be done. But
and of course you would get reasonable answers, and part of your job, I guess, as a scrutineer of government and of the House of Keys is to understand when a reasonable answer may be reasonable but still isn't right.
Well, Phil, I run small businesses, and I've dealt with a lot of businesses, a lot more than you might imagine, and I have had to, a number of times, ensure that staff are thinned out. Sometimes I've had to ensure that staff are found of a certain quality to make sure that things can be done properly. The Isle of Man is effectively a small business. On the world stage, the Isle of Man's just a blip, really. And we do seem to have an awfully large government based on the size that we are.
I mean, have you ever contemplated becoming an MHK rather than an MLC? You know, why specifically MLC and not MHK, I suppose?
Until I know more about all of the roles, the MLC role gives me direct access, really, to how legislation is actually put together. It's proper legislation practice. So perhaps down the road maybe an MHK, but I am much more backroom, really, probably, than forward-facing. I do like to fix problems, but I think MHKs probably have an awful lot of everybody's problems all to deal with at once, whereas an MLC is actually trying to fix the legislation that's being placed to fix an overall a big issue.
And do you think MHKs are well understood by the public? Do you think government generally is well understood by the public, or do you think perhaps it's rather a superficial understanding that people have?
I don't think they're understood at all, in truth. We only have to look at Facebook and the comments that are on there, and some of it can be quite disrespectful and really whether I agree with some MHKs or others, in truth, everybody's put themselves forwards to try to do the right thing. And I think the public don't really realise just how hard they have to work. I do know how hard they have to work. Yeah. So
the part of the role that of being a politician is you have a very difficult question and a whole load of unpalatable answers, and you have to pick one of the unpalatable answers. How would you go about doing that and perhaps communicating that? I mean, well, again, is that part of your role as an MLC to explain the decisions that are taken in Tynwald?
I have thought about this because there'll be quite a lot of things I won't agree with, but ultimately the MLCs are basically 11 people, and I assume, and there is an assumption at the moment, that the chairman, there must be, the MLCs must agree which direction they're going to go in, and that's then the direction you've got to go. I would have quite a lot of opinions that may not always be on the same side as everybody else, because I don't like big government. I don't like large amounts of money being spent. I don't like a lot of control where it's not needed. I like people to be able to get on with their own lives. I don't like seeing money being wasted. And I think it's probably got to a point where maybe there's too much regulation. I don't really know until I get into that. I need to have access so that I can help.
So we know that there are 16 candidates for 4 seats. So the odds for each candidate aren't wonderful for getting elected, but clearly you're hoping to be successful. Why? If I'm an MHK listening to this programme, what would you tell me are the reasons why Mark Cleator is worth at least one of your 4 votes?
Because of my well-known breadth of knowledge. I have covered a lot of ground in my life. I have worked for the government. I worked for the MEA before that. I've run my own businesses. I've helped work with other people's businesses, and it's all effectively small businesses, though on the island I have dealt with all the big names as well, and I mustn't name them, but I have to make things work. I've always had to make things work. I'm pretty much the person in my world. There's been people who rely on me, and I have to make sure that the businesses operate properly. I've always fixed things, and I've been somebody that people come to make things right. But I do have an opinion on this, and as far as I'm concerned, I just want the job to be done properly. And I can see there's 16 people, well, there's 15 people plus me that are there. And if there's people that are better than me, then that's brilliant. They can do it instead. Because just somebody has to do it properly. And I'm not suggesting it hasn't been done properly. There's just 4 seats available, and I've put myself forwards to have a look at it, see if there's anything I can do. But if there's better people than me, then by all means vote for them instead. I don't need to do it. But I will do it.
You mentioned about the small businesses that you have run and still do. Do you think government understands small business?
No, they don't. Small businesses on the Isle of Man are really hard to run, especially if you want to try and do something where there's an element of trying to send products off the island. It's just a disaster. Everything costs so much more to try to trade on the island, and then you've got a reduced the catchment area's tiny. It's almost non-existent. So if you get a few businesses all trying to do the same thing, you're all chasing after the same tiny little bit of cake. Whereas even in the UK, we're only the same size as a small town. And yet we're trying to do all of these big things. It's really, really hard to run a business on the island. And
how would you, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? What are the things that you would do to change that?
I'd certainly stop the ridiculous processes they have for deciding whether something's commercial or not on the steam packet. That's not right. So if you're a plumber and you get in your van and you go to England, you pick up some toilets and you come back to the Isle of Man and you get charged freight rates. But if you're a multi-millionaire businessman and you climb in your Jaguar and you jump on the boat and you drive all the way to London and you do a £10 million deal and you drive back, you get charged the ordinary rates. That's not right. Why is there a tax for businesses on the boat? Those businesses, if they were in England, they wouldn't have that. It's bad enough they have to get the stuff shipped here anyway. But on top of that, we've added a tax, an indirect taxation. So that's one thing. It would make it much better. Probably then it would help with all of the shipping companies that do all of the movements, that the prices would be lower. But of course, we've bought this big boat, so...
Well, sadly, on the subject of the big boat, which I'm sure we could talk forever on, that is us out of time. So thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you, Phil.
That was businessman Mark Cleator. In the week remaining before the LegCo election, we hope to hear from all the LegCo candidates so you can decide if you are standing. Please get in touch with Phil Gorn at manxradio.com so we can arrange an interview. Let me know what you think and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.